You're in for a treat because our good friend Kelsey Madigan from LA Family Housing is here with us for a special office hours session. For those of you who were at last year's conference, you'll be familiar with the format of office hours. Office hours are an opportunity for audience members to ask practice-related questions and troubleshoot issues with an expert on a specific topic. During our co-sheltering office hours, providers of interim housing can ask our experts about the logistics of operating a co-sheltering program and receive real-time feedback. So as I mentioned, Kelsey is an expert. She is the Deputy Chief Programs Officer of Unhoused Programs for LA Family Housing and is licensed as a clinical social worker in the state of California. She oversees the outreach, intake and assessment, interim housing and housing navigation departments, including departmental innovation and strategic growth. Kelsey provides consultation in best practices for design and program implementation for interim housing sites nationwide. She also provides systems-level advocacy on pet policy in the homeless services system and is working with the state of California on championing safe substance use programming and legislation. So thank you for joining us, Kelsey.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So audience members, please drop your questions in the Whova chat and we will get to as many of them as we can in the next 25 minutes. So while people are getting their thoughts together, Kelsey, I have a few questions for you to get us started.
Sure.
LA Family Housing has been co-sheltering people and their animals together for a long time now. Why was it important for LA Family Housing to start accepting animals?
Sure. I think one of our main reasons was that we were seeing a lot of participants turn away interim housing and decide to sleep on the street in their tents, in their cars, because we weren't accepting pets. So that was really a commitment for us when we are trying to be harm reduction and low barrier and be a true low barrier site. We wanted to accept participants as they were. So that has been a really positive change for us. We've accepted support animals for a really long time, but in the past several years, we expanded that to pets. And with that expansion, we saw less barriers into moving participants into our sites from the street.
So a very common fear that providers have about accepting animals on site is regarding dog bites. Providers are afraid that a dog will bite someone. Can you speak to how LA Family Housing has overcome that fear or addressed that fear?
Yeah, so before we started implementing our pet policy and having pets on site, we really trained our staff in understanding how to approach animals, what to do with specific types of animals, whether it's a dog, whether it's a cat. We have like turtles, fish, hamsters, all types of different animals at our site. So we really trained our staff on that, and then we trained participants as well. So whether you're a pet owner or not, we train our participants all the time on reminding, all right, when you're approaching an animal, what should you do? What should you not do? What startles animals? And that has prevented some of those instances for sure. Outside of that, we have a training program for the animals and all the different pets at our sites. So we have a program where a trainer comes to every different site that we have and trains the animal and the pet owner, which sometimes is the most important thing, to assist the animal in kind of cohabitating with people in a shelter coming from the street. So those are a couple of things that we've done over the years.
Great. I think that answers one of the other questions that just emerged in the chat. And so Lauren was asking about what kind of behavior support do you find participants? Well, I guess actually this question is slightly different. So you have a person, a trainer who comes on site to provide the training, both for the people and the animals. But what kind of behavior support do you find participants need for their pets most frequently?
Yeah, a lot of concerns with noise management, like barking, startling easily, and then participants who it's interesting because a lot of the behaviors, well, I guess it's not interesting if you have pets and you'll know this obviously, but when the animal has some type of reaction or scared or nervous or bored, they have behaviors that accompany that. So we focus on the root of that behavior. So if an animal is chewing through the bed or chewing through our baseboards, which sometimes, happens, we're asking the participant, all right, do we need to identify an emergency person to take your dog out on a walk, to bring it to the dog run while you're gone, to crate train it, and thinking about all different types of options to manage that specific behavior. But we do see a lot of that noise management issues, participants having a difficult time in keeping their animals in the area clean. So teaching them about appropriate maintenance for their the site that the pet is in, and then also for the pet. That has been a really good training topic. And then some of these things, if you don't have grants for these training programs, we do train the trainer programs for our staff. So maybe we'll invest in bringing a trainer in to talk to our teams about what the expectations are and how to move through some of these behavioral issues. And then we'll have that person from our staff train new staff, train the participants, assist with behavior management in that way.
Oh, that's so interesting. I love the train the trainer thing. Very cool. And I'm sure it'll come up, but there's always a question around staff capacity. Like we just don't have the ability to add one more thing to our plate. And so do you ever get pushback around like now the staff have to learn a little something about animals?
Yeah, we get pushback, of course, when there's anything that's like added to a staff duty for sure. I think that comes in the first couple of months until you see that when you're doing more preventative care type of strategies, the amount of work on the back end of like replacing beds, putting in maintenance requests, having to potentially exit an animal or things like that, it starts to make more sense for the staff if we become more preventative, but it definitely is a learning curve for sure. And for us, we get additional funding as well from the state through the PASS grant. So that has helped us kind of pad some of those areas of need for behavioral care for the pets.
That's right. There was a little bit of state funding, which absolutely helps when there's dedicated resources. So I have a question from Allison. Allison says, I recently talked to a shelter that was not open to co-sheltering due to concerns about liability and not being able to be insured. Can you talk about how your organization navigated this issue?
Yeah, we worked with our provider on the insurance package to ensure that it covered not only support animals on site, but pets. And that was kind of a tough conversation because it was rare that a site expanded into accepting pets in general and then reporting it to insurance and then getting our policy to completely cover it. But that was something that our general counsel worked on and we were able to be successful at it. It didn't raise our policy a ton. I don't know the exact numbers, but it didn't raise our policy a ton. I think there was definitely a bunch of negotiation and how that was managed for our sites. And to get that approved into our insurance policy, we had to make sure that we had tons of different safeguards to be preventative. So a lot of the training plans assisted with that, a lot of the supplies that we were able to order just in case the animal seems their behavior seems pretty aggressive and we're not able to, enroll them into training really quickly, or we don't have kennels on site. We would have muzzles if necessary, or we had a safe room for the animal until they're able to kind of manage their behavior. So those things are really important in establishing in policies prior to pitching that to our insurance company or insurance carrier.
Right. And those are all things you would want in place anyway. So,
yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, and we the only thing that we require is shots. So that was something that insurance wasn't able to get around for obvious reasons. So we do require up-to-date vaccinations, which we help the participants get as well.
Yes. All right, thank you. So I've got a question. This is a real juicy one. I've got a question from Chastity, I believe. Chastity asks, I don't know if this is a question you can answer on, but I am the coordinated entry specialist in our community, and we are still using the VI SPDAT. This assessment does not really support animal companions as well as several other factors. What assessments are you guys using to prioritize clients? Also, fun question, what's the most unique homeless companion animal you have run into?
So yes, we'll go with the serious part first, and then I'll think about the most wild, literally wild animal that we've had. So yes, the county, or at least Los Angeles County, is moving away from using the VI SPDAT for some of those very specific reasons. There are some questions that didn't fully encompass a participant's experience, including race, demographics, age, like all of those things. And also with the pet part of it, that was something that wasn't fully reflected. However, when we receive referrals and someone is matched to a site, we inquire whether they have pets, how large their pets are, how many pets they have, what type of pets they have. And then our agency makes specific accommodations for that. So for us, it doesn't necessarily matter if it's reported prior to match, because even if the person was matched to the site without us ever knowing that they had a animal prior, we wouldn't turn them away. So for us, that doesn't necessarily matter, but I can see for other agencies how it might matter, knowing ahead of time if they weren't allowing pets. Of course, we would want to get to a place where we're all allowing pets, and that's something that we can just assume that we need to accommodate for referrals. But that's a really good question. What is the wildest animal that we've had? So right now we have a rooster and a turtle that is walked on a leash, like a little turtle leash at one of our sites. But our most bizarre animal was this rare African raven that the participant got it when it was legal to have to obtain as a pet. And she was kind of grandfathered in to continue to have it when the species became something that you couldn't necessarily have as a pet. The raven's name was Morticia, and it took a bath. It ate dinner next to her. It was very interesting, and it was really a part of our site. And then recently I've had referrals for squirrels, and I'm like, that's the one thing that I'm like, okay, this legally can't be a pet. So those ones we've turned away.
I see. Wow, squirrels.
Squirrels.
You mean like a squirrel that somebody adopted from the park, or?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm like, does the squirrel know that they're adopted, or?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I have a very this is just a logistical question for my team, actually. So I can see here in the chat that someone named Yael is having trouble getting in. So if she's not in our waiting room, if Creative Allies doesn't see her in our waiting room, can somebody ask Yael to maybe look at her agenda and see which session she's trying to click? She might be trying to click the wrong one. If somebody can put that in the chat for me, that would be awesome. Because it looks like Yael is able to see the chat, but not able to hear us. All right, so then coming back to our questions here, a question from Zoe. What strategies do you have for reaching people and building trust? I work at an animal shelter that serves in a lot of ways as the municipal shelter, and find that clients don't trust us and see us as the pound. How do you overcome a bias that has been built over years of mistrust of the system? So even though Kelsey, LA Family Housing is a homeless services provider, a human services provider, I still think there are a lot of lessons that can be learned, or some learnings and tips that cross boundaries professionally, because I think there are people who distrust the system and don't really want to go to an interim housing site because of trust. So what tips do you have to share with somebody who works in an animal shelter that might sort of be struggling with the same issue?
Yeah, I think combating the narrative is something that's really difficult, especially when, and we see this a lot in analogy, you're thinking about like child protective services or something where it's not always seen as something that is helpful, although it is a really, really helpful agency, and the goal and the mission is really helpful. It's seen as like taking children away, or the same with the pound. It's, you might obtain my pet, and that's something that's really difficult for participants to manage and kind of get out of that way of thinking. I think continuing to have a narrative of support and services is really important. I know a lot of our participants, we refer them when necessary or when there's events at the Pound or ASPCA's for free vaccination clinics, for additional, services to kind of bridge that gap a little bit more. But I think what has really helped is creating partnerships that are more long-term with specific agencies where participants can see that collaboration that's specifically benefiting them. So if there were homeless services agencies in your area, whether there were that you can reach out to that maybe have people that are ready and want to adopt a pet, that can create a different kind of environment or thought process about the Pound and what, the Pound can offer participants. But that has been something that, of course, in homeless services, we deal with that all the time, where there are specific connotations related to the work. But also just once you impact 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people in the same area or in an encampment or at a specific event, word travels really fast. And that's something that we try and do as well. We try and have the same people in the same spaces, consistently providing consistent services, so the word gets out that way.
Awesome. All right, we have a question from Alan. Alan says, I applaud LA Family Housing for having a participant pet policy, including a no breeding policy. Other interim housing facilities in Los Angeles are struggling with breeding for the purpose of selling puppies and kittens as a monetary source. Did you have a lot of pushback from participants when implementing restrictions?
We had participants who were definitely concerned, and a lot of the participants that were breeding at the time, they're really open about it. And they're like, this is my income. This is how I'm going to afford to help myself get into housing. But we were lucky that the partners that we had that continued to come to site to support us, met with these participants every single week to kind of longitudinally educate them on why breeding is affecting animals in general, why it's affecting our county shelter system, how it's affecting the community at large, and that they're really able to kind of chip away little by little on the cons rather than the pros. But it was also a transition for our staff too. Our staff was having a really hard time. There were some times we had to put our foot down and say, if you are going to continue to breed, then we cannot continue to have your animals here. So you have to choose. You have to choose if you want to stay here with your animals and not breed, or if you want to find somewhere else where you need to stay. And that kind of set a precedent for what we were willing to accept at our sites. Having staff on board was a little bit difficult as well because of that. But once we established the expectation, then participants started to kind of understand why and have a little bit less pushback. And our service providers on site that specifically dealt with like spay neuters and clinics and all of that stuff were instrumental in really having those conversations specifically with the participants and the staff.
Interesting. So Mel also is contributing to the chat here on that topic of the no breeding policy, and has a question, but I think it might be more of a comment than a question. So Mel is asking about, and this might be a question for the rest of the folks in the chat as well. Is there any data on no breeding policies then causing certain ethno-racial communities not seeking services? But I think the point being that, breeding can be highly, our feelings about breeding and animals having babies and spay and neuter, it can be very culturally specific. So Mel goes on to say, I am personally against breeding, but I am also from a culture where that attitude is rare. Does the no breeding policy language at least address the socioeconomic reasons why breeding occurs first, instead of coming off as a policing tone? I just worry that some communities, including my own cultures, would see no breeding policy and immediately get offended.
I appreciate that comment. And no, I don't think that we have messaged it in that way, but I think that's a really good point in general when we're thinking about the wording of our specific policies. So I think the context of how you explain things is really important. Yes, in our policy, it says breeding is not allowed on site and breeding is not tolerated in general for animal or for pets that we serve. But yeah, I think there is totally an opportunity for context to be provided there as we're discussing our policies and the reasons why we're upholding some of those things. So thank you for that comment. It's really important.
All right, thank you, Mel, and thank you, Kelsey. Let's see here. So there was another question. I mean, the chat is actually really active, Kelsey, so it's actually hard for me to keep track of all of the comments and questions here. There was a question about, here it is. Do you think that limiting the number of pets a client can bring into the shelter is presenting a barrier to the client accessing the shelter? So sometimes clients have 1, 2, sometimes more than that, animals with them. How do you handle it?
Yeah, so I think we don't put a limit on pets when we are in our standards. We say we'll take as many as we can accommodate. Each of our sites, we have 13 interim housing sites, and they all look very different. Some of them are single occupancy, some of them are very congregate. Some of them have single rooms, but have like 3 to 5 people sharing those rooms. So it really depends. I always use the example of like, if someone comes in with 2 Great Danes, we might not be able to accommodate that, but we can accommodate like 4 Chihuahuas. That might work for the site, depending on what that looks like. So I think we use a case-by-case strategy for every single participant that comes in. We don't put a specific number on our standards specifically because of that. Like people I think the person who has a turtle has like little animals and has like a goldfish and has like all this other pets. So we don't put a restriction on that specifically for that. Instead, if we're not able to accommodate someone has 2, 3 Great Danes or whatever it is, if we're not able to accommodate at one of the site that they're referred to, we'll try referring to another site that can potentially accommodate, maybe a tiny home, maybe a single occupancy site. And if we can't, then we'll work with our pet partners to see if there are any like fostering opportunities or things like that.
Great. So how do you navigate not overwhelming participants during intake with difficult conversations? On the logistics side, it's important to sign documents, let people know about and let them know about the policies. But at the same time, it's important to be trauma informed and sometimes practice radical hospitality.
Totally. We looked at our intake packets so many times because they kept on as more, expectations and policies and statutes and whatever started coming out. Your intake policies start to get crazy long. So we try to cut them down as much as possible. At initial intake, we have an intake team that does, goes through the pet policy, goes through standards, expectations. But when the participant gets to the site, that's when we do an actual orientation where we're providing context. So, okay, here are the standards, and this is why we're asking this, and this is your room, and this is why we're asking you to stay in, your assigned bed, and this is where, your animal can be kept. And, we're able to provide context during the site orientation, which is separate than the actual intake where we're going through the motions of getting the form signed and all of those things. So that has been really helpful. And the site orientation is with the person that's going to be their assigned participant coordinator, or the person that's going to be monitoring the site. So breaking it up has been really helpful to not overwhelm the participants. Also, specifically for the pet policy, because it's also very important that the participants understand that. Obviously, we do like quarterly groups of all of the pet parents at specific sites and re-go over the policy. This is a time where they can change their emergency contact person, where they can ask additional questions, where they can discuss, different housing laws and their rights in moving into housing. So we revisit the pet policy every quarter as well.
Every quarter, wow, that's pretty frequent, actually. So it looks like there are more than one person who's really interested in the pet policy that LA Family Housing has developed. So pet care agreements are required, right? They must sign the pet care agreement. How are they used to navigate conversations when concerns arise? And also, is LA Family Housing willing to share the pet policy?
Yeah, of course. We're definitely happy to share. So I look at the expectations that we're having on our participants with their standards and their interim housing standards, and the way that we manage their behaviors, very similar to how we manage a pet's behavior. Obviously, different types of behavior, completely different in that way, but the process looks the same. So as we're expecting, with our standards, what we're expecting for the participant, we have standards for the animal as well. So when there is a like standard violation, which we hate calling it that, but someone's having a difficult time managing the behavior of their pet as related to the policy, we can give them a choice agreement and saying, hey, what do you need for support? Does the animal need training? Do they need a crate? Do we need to order another one? Do they need to be walked more? Do we need to, manage how and when you're feeding them so they aren't, using the restroom all throughout the day? They're more on a schedule. But we work with the participant the same way that we would if they got into like a physical altercation with someone, or if they, threw food at somebody or something like that. We're working with the pet parent and their pet in the same way, based on the pet standards that we have for the pet, to really try and change that behavior so that they're able to stay at the site.
All right, thank you. And I have one last question for you, Kelsey. Thank you so much for being on with us. But here's the last question. As a homeless services provider, we have had some success in the past with partnering with community agencies to provide foster care services for the people in our programs. Over time, all of the providers have stopped providing those services. They cite reduced capacity after COVID. Do you have any advice or tips to re-engage these partners and or to keep them engaged?
That's been really tough for us too. It's really difficult to get people or agencies to foster. So luckily we found a few in LA that are willing to do it without charging an arm and a leg like some of the other organizations. I would see how we kept people engaged and re-engage some of these partners is to tap into some of their other services. They might not only provide foster care, but they might provide training services, or they might provide grooming or things like that they can do to support the site continuously, even though fostering is not possible at the time. So engaging them in those additional or different services that they have at their site, and finding a way that you can partner or give and take from those services to kind of engage the foster care services again, because I know that's really, really, really tough for us to keep the fosters around. Their limited capacity because there's, they're fostering a ton of animals right now and things like that. So I would tap into the other little services that they have to try and keep them engaged, see what you can offer each other.
Yeah, and I have to, so I'm not sure, the person who asked this question, I'm kind of curious to know, and we can always discuss this offline after Kelsey has left. But in what way are you using foster care? And so I think it is tough for animal organizations right now when, like, I feel like everyone is just overflowing with animals from the community, right? And so for the folks that have families that love them already, even if they don't have a home, like, I think the goal is to try to keep those together and then to free up those foster resources for the animals that don't have, that really, really need them, right? And so that's why we're always pushing keeping the people and the animals together. And Kelsey, for you at LA Family Housing, I think foster care is used in a very limited capacity, right? It's not like the default, the first thing is that for that animal to go into foster, you provide a space where the interim housing for the people is also pet friendly and the or pet inclusive, really pet inclusive. And so the animals are welcome in that space as well. At what point do you use foster care at LA Family Housing?
Yeah, if a participant goes into the hospital or has like a short stay in jail or has or in rehab, we've used foster care in those types of situations. But that's why having an emergency contact person on your pet standards is really important, because there's usually always someone at the site, even if they just met 2 days ago, that will offer to watch the animal if there is an incident like that happens where the person isn't able to take care of their pet during that time. But yes, foster care is a special circumstance for us.
Oh, and that's so interesting that you also allow other residents of the interim housing site to serve as that emergency the alternative caregiver, I guess you could say. Well, thank you, Kelsey. That was so wonderful. I appreciate you letting the audience pick your brain. I think you've inspired a lot of confidence in providers who are here today to learn from you. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, everyone.